I want to begin before I begin by expressing my joy and gratitude to be with you this morning. It's my first time being in your beautiful worship space, and it is a tremendous privilege to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Desiree, for all of your help and support. And now I will begin with a story about a story. The author and Unitarian Universalist minister, Robert Fulghum, tells a story about a gift that he gave to his friend Willie, a Swiss Army knife, the absolute most top-of-the-line, comprehensive Swiss Army knife then available. 14 different blades, 3 different incorporated screwdrivers, and its own high-quality carrying case that itself incorporated a number of compartments and functions, including a compass. This gift was given in honor of a trip that Willie was then about to take with his family, a year-long sabbatical that would entail travel across New Zealand and Australia. A journey like that could bring all sorts of different challenges and unexpected situations. Good to have a versatile survival tool along for the trip. Willie made extensive use of that Swiss Army knife. In fact, when he returned, he could report that he had used every single component of it, several of them, more than once. You see, Willie was a father with 2 school-aged children, and throughout their trip, at slow points, or at night, or whenever they bugged him enough for another one, he would entertain them with stories of a daring child adventurer not too different from themselves. And the dramatic turn of each story inevitably depended on the clever use of one or another of the doodads on the hero's Swiss Army knife. It was a marvelous source of inspiration and a perfect visual illustration to punctuate each new adventure. Willie returned from his travels with a great appreciation for the gift. Whether or not the knife was ever used for any of its manufacturer-intended purposes, for loosening actual screws, cutting actual rope, or determining northwest, for example, that was not reported by Fulghum. Stories are, in and of themselves, versatile survival tools. We tell them to ourselves and to each other to make sense of the world and to ease our spirits when the world doesn't make sense. The journalist and essayist Joan Didion said that we tell ourselves stories in order to live. We interpret what we see, select the most workable of the multiple choices. We live entirely, especially if we are writers, by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images, by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria, which is our actual experience. This imposition of narrative, these familiar shapes that we hold onto tightly and fit around the shapelessness of life, is powerful and necessary, and sometimes saves lives, and sometimes diminishes them. And the same story can carry opposite implications when applied in different contexts. The broad story that takes up most of the Torah, the foundational scripture in Judaism, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, is the story of the Hebrew people suffering as slaves in Egypt and escaping captivity, wandering, trying to find their way into a new mode of being free together, and finally arriving on the doorstep of a new place to call home. For Jewish communities living marginal and suppressed existences in innumerable places and times, that story has been a narrative of courage and meaning. And later it became just as central to the black folks living in slavery in this country, a story of liberation. Not only the dream of it or the hope of it, but a collection of practical tools for how to get to it. Yet, in between those two uses of that story, in the chain of transmission, we find the initial white Protestant settlers of this continent. They told that story often as well. And in their telling of it, they used it to explain and to justify the forced migration and attempted eradication of the many native peoples of North America. The same story, but put to a different purpose: oppression rather than liberation. At the close-up level, the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves can likewise be both empowering and limiting. In one of his books, the Irish novelist Paul Murray describes his protagonist's descent into an existential crisis. The character declares, "It's just not how I expected my life would be." When a friend asks just what exactly the poor, struggling soul was expecting, the answer comes back, "I suppose, this sounds stupid, but I suppose I thought there would be more of a narrative arc." Disappointment in life, when it does not conform to the stories that we cling to, can be powerful and destructive. One of the socially and politically defining elements of our time is the story of the American dream failing to come to its expected conclusion for a great many people. That hard work and perseverance, or the mere fact of having been born to a certain race or gender or nationality, depending on how that story gets told, that these should rightly result in a comfort and prosperity which the ever-widening gap between rich and poor makes unattainable for the vast majority of people in America. And the question of who is to be blamed and punished for this story having the wrong ending seems to me to be the driving force in our national politics right now. But turning again to the personal, the scientist and author Ozan Varol talks about how our personal stories can get in the way of our lives. He writes, "We all have stories that we live by that aren't fixed truths. They're just old scripts we've been following without realizing it. If you tell yourself travel is exhausting, you'll only notice the hassles, the delayed flights, the cramped seats, and miss the little joys along the way. If you tell yourself you're awkward in social settings, you'll tense up before conversations even begin, missing moments that could have been easy and fun. The point isn't to force yourself to love every rainy day or magically turn into an extrovert. It's about creating space, space to question the stories you've been living by and experiment with something new. You're not committing to anything forever, you're just saying, what if?" We would all do well to remember that a story is not the truth, even though it may serve to point towards something that is true. Good storytelling is not, by definition, a pure accounting of facts, but within the context of a given story, the truth can be as explicit and unambiguous as the author wishes. So there is a power in being able to explore truth within the understanding that one is not dealing in the literal truth. The Unitarian Universalist author Kurt Vonnegut's novel Cat's Cradle includes a made-up religion called Bokononism, an entirely fictional religion would be imaginary by definition, but Buchananism is also made up because as its fictional founder and prophet, Buchanan, reminds its practitioners constantly, he made it all up. Nothing about it is real. Buchananists adopt it with this clear understanding, not because its stories and claims about the universe are factual, they explicitly are not, but because of the way that those stories and claims and the practices that accompany them make its practitioners feel. They find something true about life embedded in all of those lies. In the same way, fiction can illustrate meaningful truths through events that never happened and characters who don't exist. Not being the truth frees the story to explore what could become true. Or, as the speculative fiction author Ursula K. Le Guin put it, the exercise of imagination is dangerous to those who profit from the way things are, because it has the power to show that the way things are is not permanent, not universal, not necessary. Having that real, though limited, power to put established institutions into question, imaginative literature has also the responsibility of power. The storyteller is the truth teller. Several years ago, the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie gave a now famous talk that some of you might already be familiar with. She called that talk "The Danger of a Single Story." As a young child living on a university campus in Nigeria, Adichie was a voracious reader, and what she had to read throughout her early childhood were almost exclusively American and British children's books. She still has great affection for many of those books, but as a singular literary diet, they were nutritionally deficient. They were all about white children in the United States or Great Britain with light skin and straight hair. And because the young Adichie did not read any books by people who looked like her or by people from places like her own home, she initially could not imagine that she or anyone she knew could ever belong in a book. When she began to write simple stories at a very young age, her first characters all had white skin and blue eyes and spent their days eating apples and talking about the weather. It wasn't until she grew older and began to read books by other people from Nigeria and other parts of Africa that the young author came to realize and appreciate that she and people she knew could have a place in books as well. She needed to have more than one story about what was possible in stories themselves. When we get caught up in a single bad story about anything that is important, about a person, say, us or anyone else, or about a nation, say, ours or anyone else's, we are confined by its narrowness, and our lives grow narrow as a result. Think for a moment about someone you love and about the least flattering story that you tell yourself about them. About how she always puts her breakfast bowl in the sink no matter how many times you ask her to put it on the counter. About how he always takes his best friend's side when the three of you have different opinions about a film. About how they voted differently from you in 1984. These stories are probably true, at least a little bit, so far as they go. But if they were the only story you ever told yourself about your brother or your partner or your mother or your friend or yourself, if that one harsh story ruled that relationship, think of how narrow and strained it would make the feeling between you. Some of us may not actually have to imagine that strain, and if you find yourself in that predicament right now and wanting to change it, I want to offer you that the way out begins by writing some new stories for yourself. Not any less true than the others, hopefully more so, in fact, but viewed from a kinder angle, underlining the reasons why you love them, rather than the reasons why they drive you up the wall. It is a wonderful thing to heal our relationships with others, and it is worth doing in those places where it is possible. It must be said, though, that it is not always possible. Sometimes the hurt is too great, the breach too vast. In those cases, the best we can hope for is that all parties involved continue to live separately. But none of us have the luxury to separate from ourselves. Where our own personal stories are limited rather than expansive, a change is always going to be needed. There is no escaping the problem. At such times, the poet, musician, and author Joy Harjo counsels us to set such a burden down. She says, "At some point we have to understand that we do not need to carry a story that is unbearable. We can observe the story, which is mental, feel the story, which is physical, let the story go, which is emotional, and forgive the story, which is spiritual, after which we use the materials of it to build a better structure." And the great fantasy author Terry Pratchett puts things even more succinctly. There's always a story. It's all stories, really. The sun coming up every day is a story. Everything's got a story to it. Change the story. Change the world. The project of a congregation is to be a storehouse for and place of meeting between our many stories as people. In religious community, our personal stories mix together into one common whole, but not fused into one great lump or boiled until everything takes on the same flavor. We are instead a little bit like Willie's Swiss Army knife from before. Many different components, all a part of a common whole, waiting to be put towards new purposes that the manufacturer could not imagine or intend. It is an essential insight of our faith that things as important as truth and justice are never simple and limited ideas, written down once, some thousands of years ago, simply to be recited again and again without change or elaboration. Rather, what is true and right in life must be discovered continually, reimagined, renewed. And this takes all of us, everyone who is here and everyone who is not here, to see this done. The stories we tell ourselves and each other about ourselves are formed out of the lives that we have lived so far and shape the lives that we are leading now. And we need the insights of each of those stories in order to be truth-seeking, justice-making people in community that our hearts and the world cry out for us to be. It is a true story, in my estimation, that we find ourselves together at a dangerous moment in the history of our nation and of our planet. The earth and its oceans are getting hotter. The leaders of nations seem to be growing crueler and more capricious, almost in parallel. Old and hateful ideologies that were supposedly extinguished decades ago are now on the march again. And though I would have been quite surprised to hear myself say this just a little more than a decade ago, we presently have both a civic and a religious obligation to remain watchful and determined against the insidious creep of fascism. One of the hallmarks of the particular evil of fascism is that, like all other forms of fundamentalism, it wants to erase every competing story until the only available truth is its own tale about power and who ought to have it and who ought to be made subject to it. But the good news we must not lose sight of, friends, is that there is more than one true story about our world, even now. There are dangers in our planet and in our politics, and there is also a groundswell of courage and of hope. The age we live in needs for us each to be the heroes of our respective stories, to answer falsehood with truth and evil with justice and compassion, but not to be heroes alone, rather to be heroic together.